Hello. Today I'm going to read a little bit from the book A Day of Rest by Edna Creekmore Carman, my mother. In stunned silence, Susan stood behind the bushes and watched as the mules pulling the wagon clopped their way down the incline from the mine entrance and then around the foot of the hill before disappearing out of sight behind the tall trees. As the last corner of the wagon bed vanished behind the trees, the young girl swung around and stared in horror at the empty valley. Bert and Jim were gone. She was alone. Susan's throat tightened. Oh! Susan's face screwed up as she began to cry, softly at first, and then louder and louder. She didn't care if the men in the wagon heard her and came back. She had rather go with them than be left alone in the forest with rats and the animals. Susan even started down the incline of the road on which the wagon had disappeared, but stopped after only a few steps. Bert would scold her something awful if she followed the wagon. He had told her to go home. But she didn't want to go home alone. For a while Susan howled out her misery. Then gradually the flow of tears stopped. Susan wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and tried to remember what Bert had said. It was more than Susan could endure. Susan slumped to the ground and dropped her head on her hands and gave herself the luxury of some unrestrained crying. However, the crying gave no relief. She had already cried too much without any response from anyone. Unless someone heard you, unless there was some reaction to your distress, some change in the situation, crying did no good. Susan turned and stared at the long sweeping ridge that formed the crest of the mountain. What should she do? Go towards the sun if you get lost. Where was the sun? Susan couldn't tell. Either the trees were so tall or the sun so low, but there were no sunny spots on the leafy forest floor or on the long straight trunks of the trees. There were no individual shadows either. The whole forest was a shadow. In fact, now that she thought about the matter, it would soon be dark in the forest. Soon the night animals would come out, and the wild cat would begin to howl. Susan shivered. Was that dark place under the brush hiding a cat that even now was sitting there watching her? Suppose there was something even worse than a wild cat there. Silently, Susan sat in the darkening forest, looking at every bush that moved, dreading the appearance of an animal, any animal. Through the soft sighing of the wind in the treetops, Susan heard a sound so familiar that at first it did not reach her consciousness, a sound of rumbling like thunder, the sound of a heavy truck going uphill in gear. Susan jumped to her feet, turned swiftly in the direction of the sound. The rumbling of the truck was coming down from beyond that hill, and the truck would pass right in front of her house. Briskly, Susan began scrambling up the side of the hill, heedless of bushes catching in her hair and not even noticing the sawbriars tearing long gashes in her legs. Gasping, sobbing, Susan struggled along, making so much noise herself that at first she didn't hear the bells ringing. "Get on, Old Red," Douglas yelled at Old Red as Old Red stopped and bellowed to let her calf know she was coming. "Dad!" Susan called to her dad, but her throat was constricted by a sob. Even the sob wouldn't come out loud enough to be heard any distance. Through the bushes she could see the cows running along the path above. Her dad was striding swiftly along behind the cattle. Then, as Susan gave up hope of making her dad hear her, Douglas stopped, cupped his hands to his mouth, and yelled, "Susan! Bert!" He turned and looked in every direction before moving on. Now was the time to call. Susan stood up and put her hands up to her mouth and tried to yell. But Susan could only make a soft moaning sound before she began scrambling upwards through the bushes. Douglas was alert for any sound or movement in the underbrush. Hearing a noise on the hill below him and seeing movement in the bushes, he abandoned the path and came bounding down the hill. He stopped as he saw the wet, dirty girl standing with tears running down her face. "Susan, what's wrong?" Douglas asked as he stooped and laid a hand gently on Susan's shoulder. But Susan, with a sympathetic audience near at hand, broke into violent sobbing. Douglas, ignoring the wet, dirty dress, sat down beside Susan and pulled her close, letting her cry on his shoulder. "What is it, Susan?" Douglas interrupted her sobs, and then, after looking around, continued, "Where's Bert?" They took..." Remembering her frustration at not being able to untie Bert, on top of her fear at being left all alone, Susan sobbed and sobbed. Thoroughly alarmed, Douglas forced himself to be calm as he waited for the crying to subside. He gently patted Susan's head as it lay on his shoulder and held her close in his arms. As the sobbing slowly died away, Douglas took a handkerchief from his pants pocket and wiped Susan's eyes and face gently. "Blow." Douglas held the handkerchief to Susan's nose. With a resounding honk, Susan cleared her head. "Now," Douglas continued firmly after setting Susan on the ground and kneeling before her, "tell me, what were you doing down at the mine?" Susan stared at her dad. Forgetting Bert and Jim for the moment, she wondered how her dad could know where she had been. She did not realize that he could have traced her trip accurately by the smell of tea-berry on her lips, heart leaf on her fingers, and the faint smell of pennyroyal. But he needed only the black, gummy mud smeared on Susan's dress to tell him Susan had been in the mine. "Why were you in the mine, Susan?" Douglas repeated his question. "Bert took me," Susan replied, and fearing an immediate scolding, broke out crying again. "Now stop that crying. It will do no good," Douglas commanded severely before asking, "Where's Bert? Why didn't he bring you home?" "They took him," Susan answered tearfully. "They took Jim also." "Jim? Jim was with us." "I see." Douglas frowned. He did see why they were at the mine. Bert was showing off for the older boy. But why did Bert and Jim not bring Susan home first and then go to the mine? "Did you say someone took them?" "Yes, the men took them." "Susan, what men are you talking about? There are no men working at the mine." "The men came in a wagon," Susan whimpered. Douglas looked up through the trees at a spot on the side of the mountain. He must keep calm, keep the frustration from showing. What Susan was trying to tell him was important, but how was he going to get her to tell the story so he could understand? He slid around behind her and put his arm across her shoulders, but made no effort to stop the flow of tears. Looking thoughtfully down the hill, Douglas tried to figure out Susan's story. Jim Weaver had come back with Bert from the school. They had come through the cornfield where the cows were feeding, and then decided to go to the mine. But where did the men come in? What were the men doing at the mine? What happened to Bert and Jim that they did not bring Susan home? Bert would not have gone willingly with anyone and left Susan down there by himself.